There's a place where time doesn't just stand still, it hides. A place where the wind tells stories in a language older than any scroll, where snow-capped peaks guard secrets not written in books, and where ancient voices murmur through valleys, still echoing battles, betrayals, and bloodlines that shaped empires. That place is the Caucasus Mountains. But this story isn't just about the mountains. It's about the Whispering Kingdoms, a collection of vanished realms, lost principalities, hidden dynasties, and remote fortresses tucked deep within the folds of these formidable heights. Their histories weren't just erased, they were buried, sometimes deliberately. Yet even the earth can't silence a legend forever. Before we begin our descent into the mists of time, picture the Caucasus as more than a range. Imagine a jagged spine of the earth stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Black Sea, carving out a geographical no-man's land between Europe and Asia. It's a region of fierce beauty, brutal winters, and a tapestry of over 50 ethnic groups, each with their own language, traditions, and secrets. This is where civilizations collided, empires crumbled, and myths walked in the daylight. Our story starts not with a battle or a king, but with a path. A path that once connected east to west, a narrow caravan route, now overgrown and largely forgotten, that wound like a silver thread through the lower Caucasus passes. Traders once called it the Silk Detour, a hidden artery of commerce used when the main Silk Road became too dangerous. But it was more than a trade route. It was a lifeline for the invisible kingdoms, the ones no empire could fully conquer. At the southern foot of these mountains, in what is now modern-day Georgia, there stood a kingdom called Tao-Klarjeti. Almost never mentioned in textbooks, Tao-Klarjeti was a confederation of mountain fortresses and monastic towns ruled by warrior priests. These rulers weren't kings in the traditional sense, they were custodians. They kept alive the last remnants of Christian mysticism and pagan ritual, side by side. And they answered to no one but the winds that rolled down the peaks. To the north, nestled between icy cliffs and pine forests, was another forgotten realm, the kingdom of Alania. Imagine Viking-like warriors in white fur cloaks, galloping on hardy mountain horses, guarding alpine fortresses that vanished into the rock. These were the Ossetians, descendants of the ancient Scythians, whose rituals involved sky burials and sacred flame watching. Their language was Indo-Iranian, but their loyalty was only to their highland gods and ancestors. But between these kingdoms lay a valley no one dared to claim. The locals called it Sonara, the Hollow. To this day, you won't find it on any official map. Even GPS systems glitch when you approach its ancient stone markers. Why? Because Sonara wasn't just off the grid, it was off the record. Whispers say Sonara was once the seat of a shadow monarchy that existed entirely in the gaps of history. A place where exiled nobles, fallen generals, and heretical priests gathered to create a new society, bound not by blood, but by silence. There were no written laws, only oral contracts sealed with iron rings and snowmelt wine. And their fortress, they say, was built not with stone, but with petrified wood from trees struck by lightning and believed to be infused with the spirit of the mountain. We'll come back to Sonara later. But what's important to know is that this mysterious hollow was said to hold an archive. Not of scrolls or parchments, but of whispers, stories passed from elder to child, generation after generation. Historians scoff, of course. But local shepherds still tell you, the wind knows everything. If you sit quietly in the valley long enough, with your ear pressed to the earth, you'll hear them, tales of entire kingdoms lost to snow and silence. But what happened to these whispering kingdoms? Some say the Ottomans crushed them. Others blame the Mongols, or even the Russian Tsars. But those explanations are too convenient. The truth, as we'll uncover over the next few chapters, is far more intricate. These kingdoms weren't just destroyed, they were absorbed, dismantled piece by piece, repurposed into myths, and scattered across languages and legends. What remains are fragments, carved symbols on mountainsides, songs sung in languages no longer spoken, and ruins where no tourist ventures. And perhaps strangest of all, many of the people who live in these mountains today don't even know their own histories. That's not coincidence. That's design. These kingdoms chose to disappear. Let's return for a moment to Tao-Klarjeti. In the 9th century, a prince named Ashadai unified the region under what he called a spiritual war council. It was an alliance of monks, generals, and seers, an unusual trio by today's standards, but not in the Caucasus. Their goal wasn't expansion. It was preservation. They built monasteries into cliff walls, entire libraries hidden behind waterfall-fed caves, and altars carved from living rock. But more than that, they developed codes, visual glyphs, etched into doorways and mountain trails, which could only be read by initiates. One such symbol, a spiral with 3 outward arrows, has been found on structures from Armenia to Abkhazia. Historians claim it's decorative. Locals say it's a warning. The elders of Ajara whisper that these spirals mark safe zones for the kingdoms in hiding, or one could shelter from foreign armies if they knew the passphrase, which changed with the season and the moon. There's even a legend that each whispering kingdom had a keeper of echoes, a title passed down through generations, responsible for maintaining the oral history of their people. The keeper carried no books, wore no crown, and fought no battles. But when the time came, they would sing the kingdom's song, a long, winding poem of ancestry and oath, and the land itself would remember. One such keeper was a woman named Zelina, born in the islands of Svaneti. She was said to have eyes like storm clouds and a voice that could split pine trees. When Russian surveyors arrived in the 19th century, mapping the region and renaming villages, Zelina stood atop a mountain pass and sang for 7 days straight. When she stopped, the valley below had been buried by avalanche. Some say it was coincidence. Others say the mountain was listening. Of course, the modern world doesn't believe in whispering kingdoms or singing avalanches. We believe in borders, census reports, and satellite imagery. But the Caucasus defies all of that. To this day, there are villages unreachable by road, dialects unrecorded in linguistic databases, and mountain elders who won't speak a word unless you bring them goat's milk and obsidian beads. And that's where we begin our journey. Over the next 11 parts, we'll climb into the heart of this mystery. We'll visit ruined fortresses swallowed by fog, decode the symbols left behind, meet the descendants of kingdoms no longer recognized by any nation, and explore why these realms vanished not from war or famine, but by choice. Because sometimes, survival means silence. And power lies not in what's shouted from thrones, but in what's whispered through the trees. The higher you climb in the Caucasus, the more the world below disappears. Forests turn to craggy slopes. Rivers vanish into the ice. And the wind stops being just wind, it becomes a presence. A whisperer. An archivist of memory. It's here, in the snow-blanketed northern passes, that our next whispering kingdom once stood. A place so elusive, so well guarded by both mountain and myth, that its very name ***Karvashi** is believed to have existed only in the mouths of its people. Unlike the stone fortresses of Tauklarjeti or the known dynasties of ancient Armenia, Karvashi left behind no official record. Not one inscription. Not a single coin. But it left behind something even harder to erase, fear. Because in the valleys below, elders still refuse to speak of it directly. When asked, they only gesture to the white peaks and say, they listened more than they spoke. Karvashi is believed to have existed somewhere near the present-day border of Russia and Georgia, hidden in a glacial basin surrounded by near-vertical cliffs. According to local folklore, it was a vertical kingdom not spread across land, but layered into the cliffs themselves. Imagine houses built into the face of the rock, ladders carved into ice, and corridors bored into frozen stone, each leading deeper into the mountain's ribcage. The people of Karvashi, known as the Mruvians, were reclusive, even by mountain standards. They were said to speak in a form of coded whistling, similar to the now extinct bird languages once heard in parts of Turkey and Greece. But Mruvian wasn't just for communication, it was for concealment. The sharp echoes of their speech would blend with the sound of wind and falling ice, making it impossible for outsiders to track or understand. Here's where the story turns from curious to uncanny. It's said that Karvashi had no ruler, no army, no borders. Instead, their authority rested in a rotating council called the White Ring, made up of 12 elders chosen by Dream. Yes, Dream Star. Every winter solstice, the Mruvians would gather in silence and wait for a collective dream to name the next council. If no dream came, the old council remained. If 2 dreams conflicted, the season passed without leadership. This wasn't superstition. It was law. A culture that trusted the unconscious over the written. Some call this absurd. But high in those frozen ridges, logic bends with altitude. The Moravians believed that to write something down was to curse it, that the moment an idea was made visible, it became vulnerable. So their knowledge, their rituals, their history, all existed within memory. Oral, fluid, and adaptive. Children were taught not just to remember stories but to transform them. Every telling was a new layer, a new thread in the tapestry. Truth wasn't fixed. It was alive. But perhaps the strangest tale about Caravaggio comes from a 17th century Armenian priest named Vardan, who wrote a curious passage in his travel journal. There is a cliff beyond which snow does not fall, though the winds wail like wolves. The people there walk barefoot, unfreezing the earth with song. They drink fire from stone bowls and vanish when you speak their name. Historians dismiss this as poetic exaggeration or a drunken fever dream. But in 1976, a Soviet geological team reported strange magnetic anomalies near Mount Dombay, right where Caravaggio is rumored to have existed. Compass needles spun wildly. Radios cut out. And most tellingly, every team member reported hearing what they described as asterisk singing wind in a language no one knew. Asterisk. Coincidence? Maybe. But that's what makes the Caucasus so seductive. Every logical explanation only deepens the mystery. Now, remember Zelina, the keeper of echoes from part 1? According to regional folklore, her maternal bloodline came from Caravaggio. In fact, the word Zelina in Old Moravian roughly translates to asterisk stormbearer. Asterisk, some researchers believe she was one of the last links between the Whispering Kingdoms and the modern world. Before her death, she reportedly dictated a long oral poem to her niece, a rhythmic chant broken into 4 seasons. The poem has since been studied by linguists, mystics, and anthropologists, but no one can agree on what it means. Some say it's a calendar. Others, a prophecy. But the Moravian phrase repeated at the end of every stanza translates roughly to, asterisk, what is buried may not sleep. Asterisk. It's that chilling refrain that brings us to the fate of Caravaggio. No war ever reached it. No records exist of conquest. It wasn't burned, or invaded, or flooded. It simply stopped. Like a candle flickering out in a cave. Theories range from volcanic activity to a mass migration event caused by famine. But none explain the clean silence. The absolute absence of ruins, bones, or tools. Some locals believe the kingdom simply went deeper into the mountain itself. That when the time came, the Moravians didn't die. They retreated. Retreated to where? Here's where it gets wild. There's a cave system beneath the northern Caucasus known as the Sleeping Hollow, so deep and uncharted that modern spelunkers refuse to go beyond a certain depth. Not because it's too dangerous, but because they hear things. Not voices. Not music. Something stranger. They describe it as a feeling. Like being watched by something that knows you intimately. In 2002, a team of Ukrainian divers attempted to explore one of the subterranean lakes inside the hollow. They never completed their mission. All equipment functioned perfectly, but the divers emerged hours later, pale, shaking, and unwilling to speak. One of them later broke his silence to say, "We weren't alone down there." But it wasn't human. Could this be the final refuge of Caravaggio? Or the burial chamber of their secrets? No one knows. But every year, the mountain swallows a little more, and the snow layers its silence deeper. What we do know is this: the Whispering Kingdoms didn't leave behind monuments. They left behind questions. Why did they choose to remain hidden? Why did they abandon the written word? Why did their languages mimic wind and water? And perhaps most hauntingly, asterisk, are they truly gone, asterisk? The more we dig, the more we find ourselves surrounded by echoes. Not just of people, but of ideas, radical ones. That memory is more powerful than stone. That history doesn't need monuments. That kingdoms can exist without conquest, currency, or borders. That silence itself can be a form of sovereignty. So when the snow falls silently in the Caucasus, maybe it's not just nature. Maybe it's memory. Maybe it's a kingdom, whispering. Beneath the freezing silence of the islands, where the ice cuts through bone and time seems to pause mid-breath, there once burned a kingdom of fire. Not the fire of war or conquest, but a sacred, eternal fire said to speak. Welcome to the forgotten realm of Mazaric, the flame kingdom of the Caucasus. Located in what's now the deeply forested borderlands of southern Dagestan, Mazaric is a name barely clinging to the edge of folklore. If Karvashi was the kingdom of ice and silence, then Mazaric was its mirror, warm, mysterious, and loud with life. The two realms, according to mountain legends, never met. They did not war. They did not trade. But their destinies, somehow, were intertwined like two opposite notes in an unfinished song. Mazaric, in its prime, was a kingdom without walls. Not because it lacked defense, but because its power radiated. The heart of the realm was a natural flame that never went out, burning bright from a crack in the mountainside. Local oral tradition claims this flame was not fire as we know it, but a breath, a living pulse from the earth itself. It hummed, whispered, and even, some say, changed color depending on who stood near it. They called it the voice fire. The people of Mazaric weren't an ethnic group in the traditional sense. They were a fusion, nomads from Persia, refugees from Byzantium, seers from Armenia, and outcasts from other whispering kingdoms. They built their homes from polished basalt and painted their walls with pigments made of crushed ruby and nightshade. But more than anything, they worshipped sound. You see, Mazaric believed that all truth began in vibration. That the universe didn't start with light, but with a hum. That every human soul had a unique frequency. Children weren't named with words but with tones, flute melodies, or sun syllables that matched their aura. When a child cried for the first time, the family would listen, hum back, and settle on a name that resonated. Their entire system of governance was built on resonant law. Picture this, a circle of stone elders, each holding a curved horn carved from mountain goats. When disputes arose, land disagreements, theft, even betrayal, the accused and accuser would present their sides not through arguments, but through rhythm. A kind of sonic debate, where truth was sensed, not proven. The elders would then hum together, slowly building a deep, harmonic drone. If the frequencies clashed, the accused was guilty. If they harmonized, they were innocent. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? But when viewed through the lens of their beliefs, it made perfect sense. Harmony meant honesty. Discord meant deceit. So how did Mazaric disappear? Unlike other kingdoms that faded quietly, Mazaric's end came suddenly, like a match snuffed out by a storm. Around the 11th century, seismic activity near the eastern Caucasus increased. Travelers and nomads reported strange light shows in the sky, glowing red trails, like auroras born from the mountains. Rivers dried. Forests crackled with heat. And then, the voice fire went out. No one knows why. One theory suggests a massive underground gas explosion collapsed the inner chambers that fed the eternal flame. Another claims a volcanic fault line was disturbed. But neither theory explains the aftermath. Within weeks, Mazaric was gone. Not conquered, not buried, just vacated. Entire neighborhoods, temples, and halls left in eerie stillness. It was as if the people had walked away mid-song, mid-conversation, mid-prayer. Explorers in the 1800s found basalt carvings and sound chamber ruins, all strangely intact. In the center of what appeared to be a main hall, they discovered a series of standing stones arranged in a spiral, each stone humming faintly when touched. But only in silence. There's a folk tale passed down in southern Dagestan that says the last high listener of Mazaric, a woman named Nairi, heard the voice fire scream before it died. Not a physical scream, but a vibration so intense that it shattered the harmony of the entire kingdom. She knew then that Mazaric's era was over. Her final act was to gather the tonal names of every citizen, every child, elder, musician, and farmer and hum them into the flame before it went dark. In doing so, she preserved them not in memory, but in frequency. Forever suspended in a sound that only the mountains now remember. Today, deep in the canyons of Dagestan, there are shepherds who claim that on certain nights, if you place your ear against the right rock and hold your breath, you'll hear it, a distant song of notes with no melody, like voices trying to remember who they once were. What's fascinating is how Mazaric's influence seems to have outlived its physical presence. Musicologists have found fragments of its tonal naming rituals echoed in Sufi chanting. Some elements even show up in certain Georgian polyphonic choirs, layered harmonies that don't make sense in Western music theory, yet feel complete in the bones. And that's the real legacy of the Whispering Kingdoms. They weren't building palaces. They weren't conquering neighbors. They were experimenting with the soul, with memory, with how people could be together. Mazaric asked a simple question: what if sound was more trustworthy than law? What if music was the true language of justice? Even now, we don't have a clear answer. But the question lingers. So when you listen to an ancient flute melody in the Caucasus, or a chant that has no lyrics but moves you to tears, ask yourself, is this music? Or is it memory? As we continue deeper into the mountains, we'll uncover more kingdoms like Mazaric, realms that defied everything we think we know about civilization. Realms that whispered their truth, not into books, but into stone, snow, and sky. Next, we travel west, where the forests hide a kingdom that never died, only disguised itself. Because not all whispers are past. Not every whispering kingdom vanished into snow, stone, or silence. Some survive by becoming shadows of themselves, changing faces, shedding names, wearing new colors but keeping their hearts untouched. There's one kingdom that didn't fall, didn't fade, and didn't flee. It simply disguised itself. Its name? Vashkita, the kingdom in the trees. Modern maps place its remnants in the heart of western Georgia, nestled within the Amriti and Racha regions, where deep forests weave between low mountains and mist clings to treetops like old memories. From above, it looks like just another stretch of uninhabited woodland. But listen closely, beneath the rustle of leaves and the calls of forest birds, there's a rhythm. A hidden order. Because Vashkita never died. It just learned how to blend. Local oral histories speak of a people known as the Zvareli. According to tradition, they were forest dwellers, herbalists, and hunters. But they weren't wild or disorganized. Quite the opposite. They were highly structured, bound by codes older than most written alphabets, and governed by something called the tree law. Tree law wasn't about territory or inheritance. It was about placement. Every family had its tree, a literal one that represented their house, their ancestry, their wisdom. All decisions were made beneath it. Each tree had its own language of symbols carved into its bark, added year after year by the elders of that lineage. These weren't words. They were glyphs, spirals, knots, slashes, and stars, each representing events, relationships, dreams, and warnings. To read the tree was to understand the family. Outsiders couldn't fake it. Every mark had rhythm. Every curve, a meaning passed down in whispers from one generation to the next. This is where Vashkita's genius lay. Instead of resisting the rise of empires like the Ottomans, the Russians, or even the Byzantines, they simply became invisible. When invaders arrived, the Zvareli welcomed them with smiles, offered food, traded wood and herbs, and played dumb. They gave no reason for suspicion. The soldiers saw only peasants and woodsmen. What they didn't see was that the Zvareli were still holding court, still passing laws, resolving disputes, and preserving traditions. Just under the leaves. A 19th-century Russian botanist, Alexander Solyevin, wrote of his experience in the Racha forests. The villagers seemed ordinary, their dialect simple. But one night, I followed their singing into the woods and saw something I will never forget: men and women circling a cedar, humming in tones I could not recognize. One by one, they touched the tree's bark, whispering to it. Not praying, conversing. It was as if the tree was answering back. There were no written chronicles, no royal decrees. And yet, the Zvareli kept meticulous records, on tree's star. The forest was their library, their courthouse, and their palace. Over time, they even developed a way to transfer this wisdom. When a family tree grew too old, its bark was carefully stripped, preserved, and passed down, while a sapling was chosen to carry on the name. But what made Vashkita truly remarkable was its approach to leadership. They had no kings. No queens. Instead, They followed a system called the Circle of Branches. It was a rotating council of elders, healers, and scouts chosen every 7 years by consensus. Not by vote, but by the health of their trees. If a family's tree was sick, infested, or cracked, they could not serve. This wasn't superstition. The Zverali believed that personal integrity and spiritual clarity directly affected nature. If your tree thrived, so did your soul. If it withered, something in you was wrong. Outsiders found this absurd. But the Zverali didn't care. Their kingdom wasn't for show. It was for continuity. Even today, in certain Georgian villages, older residents speak in hushed tones about the night council, a secret gathering held once every winter solstice, deep in the forest, where the elders still meet to decide on forest use, water protection, and community issues. Locals deny knowing who attends. But some swear the meetings still happen. And that the trees remember. So why didn't Vashkita spread? Why didn't it become a dominant regional power? Because it never wanted to. Unlike the kingdoms that chased gold, land, or glory, Vashkita's aim was preservation. Of tradition. Of language. Of ecological balance. They believed expansion was the enemy of wisdom. That the wider a kingdom spread, the thinner its roots grew. Ironically, that mindset is what may have saved them. When the Soviets arrived in the 20th century, they brought with them schools, maps, and surveillance. Villages were labeled. Forests were catalogued. And yet Vashkita still slipped through the cracks. Officials marked the region as ethnically mixed, linguistically ambiguous, and economically marginal. In other words, not worth attention. Perfect. But here's the eerie part: deforestation started in the late 1970s. Roads were built. Trees cut down. Yet strange accidents began occurring. Equipment failing. Workers disappearing. The forest reclaiming cleared paths overnight. Stories spread of loggers who went deaf, claiming the trees screamed. A few even claimed to see carved symbols moving when they weren't looking. By the 1980s, deforestation in that specific region quietly stopped. Coincidence? Maybe. But perhaps the forest of Vashkita simply whispered one last warning. Today, ecologists studying the Ratchamaridi region have found strange anomalies in the soil and vegetation. Certain groves remain untouched by disease, even as blights ravage nearby areas. And some trees show carvings not made by any known tool, deep, perfect cuts that haven't faded in decades. Whether or not Vashkita survives in any official capacity doesn't matter. What matters is this: its model worked. It endured. It protected its people, its land, and its memory, not through power, but through camouflage. So next time you walk in a quiet forest and feel like you're being watched, maybe you are. Maybe you're walking through the heart of a kingdom that never left. End of part 4. Ready for part 5? Every kingdom has its throne. Some are carved from stone, others from gold. But there is one kingdom in the Caucasus whose throne was water. Not just a river, but a river with a name that could only be spoken in dreams. This was Nerik, the kingdom of the dreaming river. Flowing through what is now the disputed zones near the borders of Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Nerik River was once believed to be alive, not metaphorically, but consciously. Local myths described it as a sleeping serpent, whose body became the waterway, and whose dreams shaped the fate of its people. The people didn't just drink from it. They consulted it. The kingdom that rose along its banks, also called Nerik, was one of the strangest in the hidden tapestry of the Whispering Kingdoms. It had no fixed capital, no royal city, no palace. Its people moved with the river's rhythms, setting up clusters of stone dwellings and tear-shaped tents wherever the river widened or deepened. Their loyalty wasn't to land, but to flow. At the heart of their society were the Dream Keepers, a class of priest-navigators who didn't just guide boats or protect shores, they interpreted the river's moods. When it ran red in spring, it meant renewal. When it slowed to a crawl in autumn, it was mourning. But most importantly, when the river rose at night without rain, something that happened more than once, it meant it had dreamed. These river dreams were considered sacred prophecies. They would gather the people, no matter where they were, and the dream keepers would hold vigil, chanting through the night while throwing polished stones into the current. The patterns made by these stones as they struck the water were read like runes. From them came decisions about harvests, migrations, marriages, even war. And yes, Narek did fight wars. But not over land. They fought to protect silence. You see, the people of Narek believed that too much noise polluted the river's streams. So their settlements were quiet by design, no hammers, no bells, no shouting. Children were taught to sing in murmurs. Boats were made of hollowed reeds that whispered across the water. Even their festivals were celebrated in tones and rhythms, not roars and claps. This quiet gave rise to one of the most astonishing aspects of Naraki culture, their river language, which had no consonants. It was a flowing, foul-rich murmur that mimicked the sounds of lapping water and rushing currents. It was nearly impossible for outsiders to learn, and even harder to write down. The few who tried described it as language without bones. But perhaps the most baffling part of Naraka's story was how its rulers were chosen. They didn't inherit power. They didn't seize it. They dreamed it. Every 7 years, a ritual called the Sleepwatch was held. Every eligible citizen, man or woman, poor or wealthy, was given the same herbal tea, prepared with crushed opal root and river salt. They would lie on the banks in silence, and when morning came, they'd each tell their dreams to the dream keepers. If more than one person dreamt of the same stranger walking into the river and vanishing, that stranger became the ruler. It didn't matter where the person was from, or even if they were Naraki. The idea was that the river had chosen. And what the river chose, the kingdom followed. There are recorded stories of outsiders being plucked from nearby villages or caravan routes, brought in after multiple dreams, and crowned in silent ceremonies. These new rulers didn't reign with power, but with presence. They sat beside the river, listening. Sometimes for days. Their decrees were rare, poetic, and often cryptic. One famous ruler, known only as the one who sank, ruled for 10 years without ever speaking. It's said she wrote only one sentence during her reign: the river listens even when we do not. So what happened to Narek? One night, the river dried. It didn't shrink slowly. It didn't freeze. It vanished overnight. The people woke to find its bed cracked and dry, as if it had never existed. No storm. No drought. Just absence. Some claim a geological shift diverted the underground sources feeding it. Others whisper darker things, that the river tired of dreaming, or was betrayed by its own people. A few scattered Naraki families still live in rural parts of Armenia and Azerbaijan. You can recognize them by their obsession with fountains and wells. They keep bowls of water on windowsills, believing the river might one day speak again through ripples. In 1999, a linguist named Ada Narek claimed to have recorded a lullaby from an elderly woman in Tavush province. The melody was strange, no rhythm, no consonants, just fluid hums. When slowed and mapped, the sound matched early river currents recorded decades earlier by hydrophones in the same region. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps the river is still whispering, just not in the ways we understand. The legacy of Narek, like all whispering kingdoms, isn't measured in monuments. It's measured in intuition. In the idea that power could be solved. That leadership could come from dreams, not dominance. That an entire society could exist in tune with a body of water. It challenges everything we assume about civilization. That permanence is strength. That sound must be loud. That kings must conquer. Narek did none of those things. And yet its memory lingers. Sometimes, when rivers shimmer at dusk, and you can't tell where the water ends and the sky begins, you might catch a whisper. Not in your ears, but in your chest. Something that hums with meaning, even if you can't explain it. That's Narek, still dreaming. And as we move forward in our journey, we leave the realm of rivers and return to the heights where the last and most secretive kingdom awaits. End of part 5. / Ready for part 6?